And so we see at the beginning here, with these disciples being called and people putting their faith in Jesus, it's like the initial enlightenment. They don't really understand the full glory of God, but they're having that initial moment. Like when you become a new Christian, you know there's something there. You know you're supposed to move in that direction, but you don't know why. You can't explain anything. It doesn't make any sense. So we're looking at these moments of where they're initially placing their faith in Jesus. Doesn't mean that it's full understanding, but they're on a journey. So we're going to start today, chapter 2 of John, and lots of things to look at. So God willing, in a few weeks, we'll be able to at least hit the main points. But today is going to be a little bit of an overview, and then we'll get to some details about the wedding at Qanah, or we should say Qanah, and try to figure out what symbolically is being communicated here. So this picture, if you haven't been to Israel, well, either way, if you've been to Israel, you may have seen this. We went out at like 7 in the morning. It was absolutely freezing, but you get great sunlight because the sun's rising to the east. And this is the Temple Mount. Now, so right here is today this shrine to where Muhammad was supposedly ascended to heaven. But that was the point on the Temple Mount that used to be the temple to God. So they put it right on top of that. In the ancient world, once a spot is holy, it's always holy. So you'll always find shrine on top of shrine on top of shrine because holy spots are holy spots. Okay, so this is where God's house used to be. And then all of this surrounding it is what we call today the Temple Mount. And this was the largest standing platform in the world at the time that Herod the Great built. And it is the size of 24 football fields. And when Jesus comes in to clear the temple, many scholars propose that this area right here, this wide open space, is called the Gentile court. The space around the temple over here is where you get the court of the women and the different Jewish courts. And now you notice that the size of their sacred area is like 10 times bigger for the people who don't go to synagogue, for the Gentiles. Because God said one day, everyone's going to come here to worship me. And so if you start putting barriers to the Gentiles being able to worship God, God doesn't like that. And that's part of what Jesus is doing. As they were selling animals, that the animal market on top of that platform kept getting larger and larger and larger, which then crowded out the Gentile area to come worship God. And that's what Jesus is raging about. Hey, look, you turn this place into a market, and you're not letting the humanity come worship the creator of the universe. So just a little thought on the Temple Mount. But this is where Jesus is going to end up at the end of chapter 2, because this is the primary site for the ritual that happens in the worship of God. Okay, on the top of your handout, I put just one sentence, but this is important for us to review because John is going to be speaking symbolically, and we need to think symbolically. But across the top, I included the 4 senses of Scripture. So from not only Judaism, but into the majority of Christianity, you have attempted to read the Scripture at multiple levels, even at the same time. So you start with something that is, in like the Christian would say literal, or in the Jewish, the word is pashat, literal or direct. And then you want to say, okay, Jesus literally turned water to wine. But then you have to start saying, well, what does that mean? What are the symbols? And as you do that, you go deeper and deeper and deeper into the mystical, into the mystery. But the more symbols, the stronger the symbol, the more it holds onto your soul. You could say you recognize the symbol or the symbol captures you. That's different than giving a rational discourse. So when we talk today, I just wanted to point out, we're going to go past the literal. We're going to look at remez, the hints. What are the hints that John's putting in this text? What are they pointing to? What are some of the secret things that we just don't see but are intuitively there? And just a thought. So you have the ancient mind. So in the ancient world, terrible handwriting here, versus, and I'll put it's Western, but it's post-Enlightenment. Okay, so post-Enlightenment, and that's all of us in the West. In the ancient mind, intuitive knowing. So how do you know something? So how do you know? Well, a lot of it was intuitive. Today, we don't like intuitive knowing. People discount intuitive knowing because we are in the post-Enlightenment, and this is dominated by rational thinking, almost to the point of a tyranny, because you can't just say, look, I know that's not true, or I know it is true, without being discounted. Now, coming to Christ, when you say yes to Jesus, the world says, no, can't study it, can't put it in, I don't have 8, studies by experts telling me that Jesus is Lord. You're like, no, I just know it. I know it in my soul. I can't explain it to you. So it's intuitive knowing rather than rational knowing. And we are in a world, we even as Western Christians, we love it when someone comes along like Ravi Zacharias, who can very rationally explain something about Christianity. We feel better. Oh good, there's a rational explanation. But the ancient mind didn't do that. The ancient mind was intuitive. It's symbols. You're not holding on tightly to a logical and rational explanation. So anyways, I just want to point this out. We live in the rational world, and therefore it's important for us to say, oh, wait a minute. Let's think about how they thought, which is radically different, symbolically, intuitively. If something can bring you closer to God, even if you say, well, I don't know if it's specifically there, well, then great, it brings you closer to God. And that's what this final one is down here. On the Christian side, it's called anagogical. And anagage is a word that means to lift. So if you're reading the text and you say, whoa, there's a connection there, and it lifts your soul, well then, you don't need a study to tell you that it's there. You felt it. It's something that lifted you towards God. You don't want to become dogmatic about it because someone else might not be able to see it, but it's the whole point of trying to take somebody deeper. I mean, even, in John the Baptist says, Jesus, here comes the Lamb of God. Now, is Jesus literally a lamb? No. So all of us get that. So he's pointing to something about a lamb that God has that's going to do something for the world. And we have to go into that symbolic era or area rather than logical, literal. Okay, I beat that to death, but this is where we're going today, because when we get to the end, I'm not trying to make dogmatic statements. I just want you to look at anything that says, I think I see something there, whether you can prove it or not. Okay, so here's John chapter 2, and this is number 1. You've got first of all, it's highly symbolic, but you've got 2 events. The wedding at Qanah, where Jesus turns water into wine, and we're going to say, this is the first sign. Then it's going to be the clearing of the temple courts. Now, at first glance, they look completely separated, but we're going to see that there are many points that are going to be overlapping by these 2 events. John puts them together for a reason. Now, when I emailed out on Sunday the basic announcement for starting chapter 2, I put in a whole list of things that we're going to cover. Now, I'm not going to go into them in detail right now. I just want to introduce them to you. But these are all things that you can see happening in John 2, okay? So, just real quickly, and this is on number 2 on your handout. So, obviously, we'll talk wedding at Cana. Now, there's a couple things going on here. One, we've already talked a little bit about that word Qanah, which means zealous. And then the second part is something about a wedding. Is that wedding holds a deeper symbolic or deeper symbol for God and creation. And so it's no surprise that what's happening is happening at a wedding, and we'll talk about that when we get to the end. So the wedding at Cana. Let's see. Water to wine. Now, this is a tough one because, well, first of all, it's a tough miracle because you're trying to figure out what is this telling us. And scholars don't agree, and there's all kinds of ideas about it. But there is a god in the Greek world. We'll have a whole session on this about the god Dionysus. And Dionysus is said to turn water into wine. So water to wine is not something... Water to wine in the ancient world holds symbolic meaning. And then Jesus is going to capture that. But we want to know, what's the symbolic meaning, water to wine? Okay, water to wine, then we're talking about, Mary. Well, she's in here. There's a conversation about Mary, and that's always a difficult conversation. It does not lend to easy interpretation. But one way to look at Mary is she's an example of faith. She doesn't, obviously we know her background from the other the Gospels, but for her, she just says, hey, we need something, and assumes that Jesus is going to be able to produce it. She doesn't need signs or anything like that. She has faith that Jesus is going to be able to do it. So she's an example of faith. I just mentioned this about this god named Dionysus, who was said in the ancient world that he turned water into wine, but that is it's a symbol of transformation, divine transformation. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we'll go into that Greek context because John's writing from Ephesus. Let's see. All right, this one, there's a Greek word, pisteo. It's used throughout John. It's like it's everywhere in John. To believe, to have faith. And we want to talk about that Greek word because it encapsulates a little bit more than what we think about when we think belief or believe. A lot of the word believe is an idea of trust. Do you trust that this is accurate? Do you trust that God will meet you tomorrow? Because if you do, you act different today. Right? Did Mary trust that Jesus is going to bring good out of this scenario? So belief, faith, and trust. We need to talk about how we think about that conceptually. You see all over the Gospel of John, it's obviously the revealing of God's glory. That's what John tells us specifically, that the story is the 7 signs reveal the glory of God. And over and over and over, you hear about this hour, this moment where glory is revealed. So that's going to be one that's at least introduced here. Let's see. Glory, signs, and belief. So there's a scholar, I'll show you his book a little bit later, William Countryman, and he points out that signs are not anti-faith. Signs are actually a path to faith. John is not anti-sign. We use signs. When we see God show up in our life, we use them to build our faith that he'll be there again tomorrow. If he showed up 9 times in a row, well, guess what happens the next time that you wonder where God is? Well, he's probably working in the background somewhere. You just can't see him. So we have to remember, as we see signs of life, of God interacting with our own world, and that emboldens our faith. Okay, temple cleansing, some of the significance of that. And then there's this phrase about they believe in his name. What does that mean, to believe in his name? And that will be a few weeks from now. So that's just the main topics. We're not going to, like I said, we're not going to cover them all today. I want you to hear them multiple times so that when you're reading John 2, which is only 25 verses, you can see how much is packed into that. Okay, so we have these two events. We have the Cana wedding, we have the temple clearing. And down on number 3, we have to set the stage here in John for what's happening and what he is likely communicating to us and his audience. So the first thing we'll note is that repeatedly I will remind you that John is using the path of these disciples in his letter to his community to show you the path to one day abiding with God. That it's not something that happens immediately, that you work to grow closer and closer to God. And so we see at the beginning here, with these disciples being called and people putting their faith in Jesus, it's like the initial enlightenment. They don't really understand the full glory of God, but they're having that initial moment. Like when you become a new Christian, you know there's something there. You know you're supposed to move in that direction, but you don't know why. You can't explain anything. It doesn't make any sense. So we're looking at these moments of where they're initially placing their faith in Jesus. Doesn't mean that it's full understanding, but they're on a journey. So we're in a stage of initial enlightenment. Then there's an idea, because water to wine is transformational. It's divine transformation. This is how the ancient people saw that. Well, what happens when we come to Jesus? It's a transformational event. Our soul is transformed. So you're right at the beginning of that transformational event, but it is no doubt your soul is transforming when you connect to Jesus. I mentioned this, that the signs, right, as we see God showing up in our world, the signs propel us forward. They give us the confidence to take the next step in faith or trust that God was there yesterday, God's going to be there tomorrow. And that those signs then help us move forward. This is a really important one. Grace. Now, grace here is not only undeserved favor, as we think about it today, but in the ancient world, grace is a gift. It's any gift. It's any favor that God provides. It's any living water that came out of a spring is a grace. It's a benefit that you didn't have to go get, and God provided it for you, and it's refreshing to the soul. So it's a grace. So a grace is a gift. A grace is a God's favor towards humanity. And yes, it is undeserved, but they didn't use it in that sense as much as we do today. But what Jesus is pointing out here is the grace, the transformation that can take place in the human soul happens before the ritual. God doesn't demand that you take on the full Torah in order to receive a benefit. And that's Paul's argument, and that's an argument throughout the New Testament, that God is inclined towards humanity to provide gifts, whether ritually we've done the right thing. The book of Exodus, God delivers them and then says, okay, now obey me. So the obedience to God comes later on this side. I provided you the gift, the grace. Now that you've come into relationship with me, now we're in a covenant relationship that you have to abide by. So we notice that there's two symbols of ritual. The jars that hold the water for ritual cleansing. And then you have the temple itself, which is the main site for the ritual to worship God. But if you come to God, He'll start changing you, whether you know any of the rituals or not. And that's the gift. Well, second, how much is the gift, if we look at this as a gift, right? God created humanity above the animals, and we have the ability to transform. That's a gift. You're not stuck. Oh, I've got all these bad habits. My way of thinking is terrible. God says, okay, come on, move towards me, and I'll change all that. So that's the gift, is that I'm not the same person that I was before. It's a wonderful gift that God gave us that we can transform. So grace precedes the ritual, really important piece in both the Cana and the temple clearing. This is what I was just ranting about. The transformation that happens is not dependent on the ritual, right? Salvation is through grace, the gift that God gives us, not through rigid adherence to some particular set of rules. Now, what's interesting is, because we can easily point out the speck in the Pharisees' eyes as they're creating rules, but then we can't see the log in our own eyes as Christians, as we've created a whole bunch of rules that say, nope, you can't get any blessings from God unless you follow X, Y, and Z, unless you go to confessional and the priest blesses you, or there's all kinds of things. You say, oh, no, you can't receive a blessing from God. It's like, well, not depending on the ritual. So we kind of do the same thing. I think that's just human nature. Okay, and then the last one is you have these ritual symbols, and that's what's really we want to point out as you're reading John. Notice the ritual symbols. The water jars and the temple itself are the points of ritual. Okay, now that was a long rant. Any thoughts thus far?